Welcome to our next class in Minor Prophets as we focus on the prophet Habakkuk. So if you'll go ahead and open your Bibles to the book of Habakkuk, that's where we're going to be for most of the study today. The prophecy coming from Habakkuk is honestly probably one of my favorite prophecies in all of Scripture. And part of the reason why it's so intriguing to me is it gives us a lot of good insight into God's providential care. A lot of times I know in life things seem unfair and it may seem like God is distant in a situation when all the while His hand is in the middle of it and He has full control. And this prophecy here in Habakkuk shows these kind of things. And so maybe if you're at a point wondering how God is involved and how maybe sometimes it doesn't make sense of how God is involved in your life and in ways that He is working, this prophecy gives us some very good insight into God's providential care. And so let's get right into it to give you a little bit of background and understanding of who this guy is. The meaning of his name is actually uncertain. As you've noticed with a lot of these studies, we get some kind of idea from who this person is from maybe another prophecy, maybe even sometimes the New Testament. Maybe we see their name somewhere else, somewhere in one of the Old Testament books. But here we don't really know a lot about him. One commentary says that scholars suggest that his name may be a loan word, which means to embrace in order to comfort someone. And so that may be what Habakkuk is really trying to do. He's trying to comfort a group of people. He is referred to, though, as you notice in verse 1, as a prophet. And he was very aware of the situation of the people. And the people, of course, that we're talking about today are the people of Judah. And look with me right now in verses, just to kind of notice that he is aware of their situation. Read verses 3 and 4 with me. He says, "Why do you make me see iniquity? And why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me, strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted." And so you can tell that he is noticing things that are happening. And one of the things that we're going to notice in just a little bit is that what this oracle or this prophecy really is based on all these things that he just sees. Now, of course, in verse 1 in 2, we see that these are words that God is giving to him, or sights that God is giving him for him to translate. And so one of the things that we're going to see as we look through this text is how Habakkuk is describing how God is going to hold the Babylonians accountable for their brutality. And one of the things that you'll notice as we start getting through this text, that in the very beginning, Habakkuk didn't know why God was, I guess we would say, allowing the Babylonians to be so cruel to his people. And to him, it didn't make sense. He was wanting his people to listen to God, to get focused on his words, but he didn't want the Babylonians to be the ones to get their attention. Maybe a good way to explain this is, if maybe we were at a bad state in America, maybe you think we are now, of course, spiritually, and he decides some evil nation to get our attention and to destroy us in some type of battle. You may say, well, God, I wanted you to get our attention, but just not that way. And that's part of the thing that he's struggling with here. And so, to me, one of the ways that we could definitely describe Habakkuk then is that he is an argumentative prophet. And so the whole text is pretty much Habakkuk arguing with God for a while, for the first few chapters, about how, God, this is not the way I would do it. This is not the way I don't think you should do it. He's kind of in a way telling God what he thinks should happen. Now, that's a little bit of background into the text. Now, what about the date? According to most people, they believe that the date was just after the fall of Nineveh, which seems to make sense. If you remember back to our last study, the fall of Nineveh was around 612 BC. And one of the things that you notice if you look in verses 5 and 6 and also verse 10 and verse 13, that it's mentioned the Chaldeans or the Babylonians, same thing. These are a growing group of people. And so that kind of makes sense for the dating. Let's look in verses 5 and 6. It says, "Look among the nations and wonder and be astounded, for I am doing a work in your days that you have not believed if told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. Of course, you hear about what the Babylonians are doing. It says they're a bitter and a hasty nation. They're taking things from other people that don't belong to them. Now, skip down to verse 10. It says, at kings they scoff, and at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it. Again, one of the things that you see about this great power of people that he's describing here is there's actually a big sign of arrogance from them. They don't care what's people's and what's not people's. Skipping down to verse 13, he says, you who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows them up? The man more righteous than he? And so one of the things that you can kind of see a little bit, I guess, in that verse 13, Habakkuk's frustration. Again, here he is, he's trying to do what other prophets did, to try to speak truth to these people so that way they can correct themselves and fix what was going on. He finally goes to God and says, listen, I'm throwing my hands up, they're not listening. I'm having no way, shape, or form being able to penetrate their hearts. And so what God does is he says he's raising up the Chaldeans, he's raising up the Babylonians to wake these people up. And so he's saying here, he said, listen, God, why are you just looking at these traitors and letting them get away with this? We can't remain silent. If we do, they're going to swallow them up. And I'm probably thinking, God's thinking, well, yeah, that's the point. And so, as I said before, as we look at the contents now of this text, Habakkuk's book is described as a dialogue between he and God. And as I told you before, to me, you can see, I guess, a little bit of an argumentative side of him in the text. But the interesting thing to me, though, about it all as we go through the content is how, yes, while Habakkuk was in fact arguing with God and he didn't quite agree, one of the things that he finally realized that his will is nowhere close to God's will. And he finally surrendered all of his control in what he thought was right over to what God knew was right. And so you can see how Habakkuk actually resolves his issues, and he serves in a great way. And to me, it's a great story of how we need to surrender over to God's control and to understand his providential care, but also how we can find resolution with the problems that we're facing today. So let's go through the text right now, and I've got it divided up right now into 6 different parts, and I want to go through these 6 parts together. Let's look at the first part where you can see that the prophet is complaining. Let's look in verses 2 through 4. He says, O Lord, how long shall I cry for help and you will not hear? Or cry to you violence and you will not save? And why do you see my iniquity and why do you look idly at wrong? Destruction and violence are ever before me. Strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. Again, this is his frustration. He's like, Lord, how long? How long do I have to cry out? These people, I look around, there's violence, there's destruction. These people are literally killing themselves. And, what else am I going to do to get their attention? Now, if you notice this phrase, how long, is actually a very common phrase. If you flip over the book of Revelation in chapter 6, and look at verses 9 through 11. Revelation chapter 6. Like I said, let's read verses 9 through 11. It says, When he opens the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of the Lord and for the witness he had borne. They cried out with a loud voice, O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? Then they were given a white robe and told to rest a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be complete, who were to be killed as they themselves had been. And I guess this cry of how long is a common thing when people are actually maybe wanting justice or to get people's attention. How long do we have to live in such a cruel thing? And so that's the first part. Here, Habakkuk the prophet is complaining. Now, in verses 5 through 11, look at the Lord's, as your heading may say, the Lord's answer or God responds. And let's read verses 5 through 11. He says, "Look among the nations and see, wonder and be astounded. For I am doing a great work in your days, that you would not believe if I told you. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swift to devour. They call for violence, all their faces forward. They gather captives like sand. At kings they scoff, and at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it. Then they sweep by like the wind, and go on, guilty men whose own might is their God." I seriously think when God responded to Habakkuk, his jaw was probably dropped. He's like, "Yeah, I'm trying to get Judah's attention, but not in this way. Wasn't asking you to raise up the Babylonians, this evil group of people, to get their attention." And so Habakkuk goes from, of course, he was complaining, then God responds, and then Habakkuk complains again. And so what I want you to do is, if you will open up your Bible to Habakkuk chapter 1, staying there, I want you to read verse 12 of Habakkuk chapter 1 and all the way through verse 1 of chapter 2. Habakkuk 1:12 through chapter 2, verse 1. And this is, of course, Habakkuk's second complaint to God. And again, you can kind of see what I was talking about in the beginning. It's almost as if Habakkuk's trying to talk God out of something, almost as if Habakkuk knows better. And it's interesting that Habakkuk's honestly kind of reminding God about the whole situation. Well, who knows about the whole situation? God. But Habakkuk's is like, well, let me kind of inform you, God, in case you've forgotten what's really happening here. And then, this is his complaint again. And to him, I think it was difficult because the response to raise up this group of people to harm his people seemed maybe unjust and maybe even just a little bit inconsistent with God's character in previous times. And so you again have the prophet Habakkuk complaining. God responds. The prophet complains again, and then guess what happens again? You guessed it. God replies back again. And so let's read verses 2 through 4 of chapter 2. It says, "And the Lord answered me, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so he may run who reads it. For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end, it will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come, it will not delay. Behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him, but the righteous shall live by his faith." And so here is God's final words, and you can actually tell how final it is. He says, what I want you to do is I actually want you to put this in the tablets. And what he's really saying more than anything is, I want you to put this in to make it solid in stone to where it's something that cannot be changed. And if you know notice in verse 4, this is his whole key, I guess you could say, for survival, is in verse 4. If you'll reread verse 4, you'll notice when it says, "Behold, his soul is puffed up, it is not upright within him, but the righteous shall live by his faith." The righteous shall live by his faith. All right? And so that's God's final reply. And so let's see if Habakkuk's going to come back with something else again. But if you notice, as you pick up in verses 5 through 20, that he actually begins to surrender his will over to the Lord's will. That he said, you know what, the Lord's being very persistent in this, and so he definitely must know better than me. And so here's what he gives in verses. If you'll open up your Bible and start reading in verse 5 and read through verse 20, it's again those woes, those warnings, or it's almost like a funeral for a group of people, that he gives woes to these Chaldeans. And so if you'll read verses 5 through 20 of Habakkuk chapter 2. And you can kind of see as you look through these five woes what the woes are really consisting of. You know, woe to him who is evil. You see, woe to him who uses, goes after blood. Woe to him who takes things from his neighbors, and woe to him who does unjust things. And makes idols. And so, he's saying, woe to you who have lived in this kind of thing. And so, what he's kind of doing, he's going back and saying, I understand, God. Understand, God, why you're doing this to wake up Judah, to get their attention, because, for so long they've been this, they've been that, and they've been that. And so evidently nothing is going to get their attention. We've tried preaching, we've tried encouraging them, and nothing is getting their attention. And I love in verse 20 how he closes, because his scene, and it comes to an end here in this section, when he is just pretty much showing how God is in fact in control. And as mentioned to you, that's a neat idea behind this text, is God's providential care. In verse 20 it says, but the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silent before him. To me, what that's showing is that God is not distantly involved in this situation, that he is extremely involved. It may not seem like it, it may not make sense to some people, but he is definitely, it says, in his holy temple, that he is in control of the situation. Now, I want you to see and read verse chapter 3, because this is Habakkuk's anthem of praise, or Habakkuk's prayer. And it's just really neat to me how he can shift so much from one thing to the next. So if you'll read, it's not very long, just 19 verses, Habakkuk chapter 3. In this anthem of praise, in this prayer by Habakkuk, comes at the very end with him rejoicing in the Lord, which to some may seem kind of like an odd thing, the fact that he just argued with God, but I think he's rejoicing in the fact that knowing that God is in fact in control. He says in verse 19 that God is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. And so again, let's go through the whole organization of what we just looked at. Habakkuk is complaining to God about how the fact he's going to his people and saying, listen, you need to straighten up. They're not hearing me. He said, I'll look around. All I see is violence. I see destruction. God responds and said, hey, I got it under control. I'm going to raise up this evil group of people called the Babylonians to get their attention and to take control over them. Habakkuk kind of backs up and says, well, that's not exactly what I was thinking, and then re-explains to God the situation. God says, no, I'm telling you this is going to work. This is going to get their attention. Sounds maybe familiar to you. We actually had a discussion about this in one of our discussion boards about how God sometimes will get our attention through circumstances and situations that normally we would not think would ever get our attention or be useful. And so God gave his final reply and said, no, I want you to write this in stone. This is how it's going to happen. So Habakkuk surrenders his will over to God's will and praises God in the whole situation. Now, let's look at a few of the, as we always do, the eternal truths within the text. The first thing is this, that faith is the answer to every spiritual, moral, and physical dilemma. Because if you look in chapter 2, verse 4, that's what he says. He says, but if you want to know how you can be saved through all this, he said, the righteous are those who will be living by faith. Flip over to the book of Hebrews for a second. And I want to look at Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6. And this is a verse I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. And without faith it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that if he exists, that he rewards those who seek after him. And one of the things that you notice about the New Testament is seeing these ties. The New Testament actually mentions Habakkuk when describing faith a lot. Flip over to the book of Romans. And look in Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1. And look at verse 17 with me. It says, for in the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteous shall be living by faith. And of course, he here is quoting Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4. And flip over to Galatians chapter 3. Just a few pages over. Galatians chapter 3, verse 11. It says, now it is evident that no one is justified before God by the law. The righteous shall live by faith. And one more time, if you flip back over to Hebrews chapter 10, verse 38, it says, for my righteous one shall live by faith, and if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. And so the first truth is that faith is the answer to everything. The second thing is this, is that evil is self-destructive. The way I kind of like to look at this, I know it sounds maybe like a funny illustration, but Gotham City. If you've ever seen or are interested in Batman, which I am, one of the things that's interesting about that is Gotham is, if you remember any footage of the city, it looks horrible. It's dark, it's dreary, most of the businesses are closed down, and the reason is the place was so evil, it was literally consuming and killing its own self. And that is a lesson to us that, evil, while it may feel like it's winning, it will always fall. Flip to Galatians chapter 6, verse 7. Galatians chapter 6, verse 7. It says, do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, he will also reap. What he's saying is, whatever bad decisions you're making, you will have to live with those consequences. What he's saying, there will, in fact, always be consequences. A lot of times we toss up things that we're doing and it's maybe fun, harmless, all the while forgetting that everything that we do, every bad choice that we make, we're going to have to live with those consequences. We are all shaping our life to go somewhere. And that's what Habakkuk is saying. Look around. I'm seeing around. All I see is evil and destruction. God's saying, listen, it's going to take care of itself. Evil is always self-destructive. The third lesson is this, that suffering is not an indication of God's absence, but of his presence. I was reading a book a few weeks ago, and actually one of the teachers, one of my favorite teachers from Faulkner, Dr. May, he wrote a book on providence. And one of the things that he was talking about in the book is that, we look at a lot of times as suffering as a time where God has just left us and forgot about us. But I love in the book how he talks about that suffering is a sign of God's care to show that, listen, through this suffering, I'm going to let you see what you need to see. I'm going to bring you closer to the Lord. And what's neat is if you look at any philosophers and a lot of their writings, they say the exact same thing, that it's in their suffering and through their difficult moments that they grew the most. It sometimes didn't make sense. They didn't really enjoy it. But it's kind of like if you work out. Whenever you work out and exercise, what really happens is your muscles tear all over your legs and your arms. It's not a fun thing, but in order to grow, you had to go through something that was kind of difficult. And so God is not being absent by allowing these people to suffer. He's actually showing more care because he's saying, listen, I'm trying to save your soul. You're here in this earthly life for just a short amount of time. And, I'm looking down the road for your eternal salvation, and you're not on a good path right now. And so I'm going to put you through something to help you out in the future. And the fourth truth is this, that faith generates courage during times of crisis. Look in Habakkuk chapter 3. And I want to look at verses 17 through 19. If you'll flip back to Habakkuk chapter 3. Verses 17 through 19, it says, though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food. The flock will be cut off from the fold, and there will be no herd in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes me my feet like the deer's, and he makes me tread on high places. And so faith is something that can generate the courage. It's what he talked about in chapter 2, verse 4, that righteous need to live by faith. It's you think about Peter stepping out of the boat. What was it that really caused him to make that courageous step? It was faith. Well, of course, yes, he fell, but what about the other guys in the boat? You have a bunch of other guys that didn't, step out. Yes, Peter is the one that is known as failing because he took his eyes off Jesus, but at least he got off the boat. And for him to take that courageous step, it did have to do with faith. Thanks so much for your attention in the study, and looking forward to our next time together.